Hi, everyone. Today we are launching Ask BNEF, our newest way for clients to interact with research. Ask BNEF gives Bloomberg clients an opportunity to ask questions directly with analysts that authored some of Bloomberg NEF's most recent research. We'll be holding these sessions regularly, so please check bnef.com/events for our full schedule. This session will discuss the Power Grid Long-Term Outlook 2021. My name is Sanjit Sangera, and I'm the lead author of this publication. And I'll start by giving you a brief introduction to the piece. Please submit any questions you have throughout the session using the question box to the side, and I'll start to answer those questions at the end of my session. And with that, let's start. The research expands on the grid analysis presented in the economic transition scenario in Bloomberg NEF's New Energy Outlook 2020. So let me describe that a bit at first. The economic transition scenario is an economics-led view on the deployment and diffusion of commercially available power generation and storage technologies. It's not a net zero scenario. Instead, it describes where we get to if economics takes the wheel. In total, we find that the world will need to invest roughly 15 trillion in generation and storage assets until 2015. This bar chart shows how that breaks out. Then we take that forecast for generation, storage, and the underlying view it has about how electricity demand will evolve. And we use that to calculate what grid infrastructure would be needed to realize that power system. And again, by grid, I mean transmission, distribution assets, so that's power lines, substations, transformers, so on. One thing to note, regulatory models, finance structures, and policy are not inputs to our modeling. Our assessment focuses on the needs imposed on the existing network based on expected generation and demand growth specified in the economic transition scenario. We can start by calculating the contribution from new connections. So this is the portion of grid infrastructure that's needed to either serve residential, commercial, or industrial demand, or integrate new generators onto the grid. And so we estimate that's about $2.9 trillion globally. Next, we add the contribution for network reinforcements. This is the portion of grid investment that occurs deeper into the electricity grid. Here, the objective is to either maintain system reliability or improve efficiency. And we estimate that's about 5.3 trillion in investment. And finally, we have asset replacements of the transmission and distribution grid. So this accounts for 5.8 trillion, and it's the largest piece of investment, roughly about 41% of total spend. And so there's already 75 million kilometers of grid globally, and it's aging. In aggregate, we end up with 14 trillion in grid investment to 2050, which is about comparable to the expenditure on the power plant side. Now, here are a few breakdowns of the 14 trillion in investment. The way to read this chart is that every stacked column is 14 trillion, and I've just segmented it differently. The first one is the same as you saw on the previous slide. Next, we show how the 14 trillion breaks down by market, by voltage, what portion is digital, electrification, and even storage. And there's four key things I want to point out, and I'm going to talk about them as we go through here. One is that Europe is bigger than the US. Two is that distribution is bigger than transmission. Three is that digital is a whopping third of grid investment. And fourth is that energy storage doesn't really disrupt traditional investment. It's only 2%. So let's talk about all those things. On this slide, I show how the expenditure is evolving over time. So investment's growing from about 235 billion today to 636 billion in 2050. So that's a compound annual growth rate of 3.4%. On the right, I've broken out the same data by four key markets that we looked at more closely in this particular research. So China, US, Europe, and India. Now these four markets actually represent 2/3 of all grid investment globally. The US is the second largest market today. We estimate they spent 49 billion in 2020. Investments eventually double and they exceed 100 billion. In our scenario, it takes over a decade for a grid investment to really accelerate in the US. And this is because we saw that gas really remains entrenched in the generation mix. But please note that the scenario doesn't take into consideration a lot of the recent announcements around infrastructure plans in the US, which could accelerate investment, right? The next, Europe is the third largest market today, and eventually it does surpass the US in our analysis because of heavy decentralization, remote renewables, and also underground is playing a larger role in Europe, and underground will escalate the cost of a given kilometer of grid that's added either on the distribution or transmission grid. And I'll mention China quickly too. It's the single largest market. It spends 2.9 trillion between 2020 and 2050. And electricity demand there, it's growing rapidly, but it does slow after 2035 and peaks in the mid 2040s as the energy intensive manufacturing industries give way to kind of a lower intensity service sector. And when that happens, investment almost falls to today's level, with much of the difference explained by rising asset replacements. The assets in China, the amount that were installed in the last few years is extraordinary. We estimate that half of China's grid were installed the last 10 years, and 85% are less than 20-year-old, following a recent era of heavy expansion. The second point I made was with regards to the distribution expenditures being bigger than transmission. The growth in grid investment is disproportionately coming from the distribution grid. Annual investment in distribution networks increased more than threefold, from 121 billion in 2020 to 401 billion in 2050. And by 2050, transmission lines make up 37% of grid investment compared to 48% in 2020. So this is kind of a change from 50-50 to a 60-40 split. What's causing this? Well, the main answer is decentralization. My chart on the left shows the scale of different power plants. Nuclear facilities are often multi-gigawatt, coal is about a gigawatt, gas is maybe 500 megawatts on average. And then you can see wind and solar, we're talking about 50 to 200 megawatts. This is an order of magnitude smaller in scale. On the right side, I'm showing the scale of the median power plant and how it changes over time. And you can see, for example, in Europe, the power plant in 2020, the median power plant where an average unit of energy was being delivered from was about 800 megawatts in 2012. And by 2020, it was 562 megawatts. By 2050, we expect it will reduce below 100. And so this reduction in scale of the power plant results in more grid connections at distribution voltage, which in turn triggers investment on that network. That means that generation that was never intended to connect at the distribution level voltage is going there, and now we need to invest in the grid to make it capable of doing this. But one thing I don't want to lose sight of is that the transmission grid actually still plays a very important role. We need it to connect markets. We need it to balance power between grids, improve reliability. And although the transmission investment does drop relative to distribution, it still grows in absolute terms. And there's a few reasons why this is happening, and this is an example. So here's China, and the blue shows regions that are exporting power on their ultra high voltage power lines. The purple are regions that are importing power from ultra high voltage power lines. And there's a divide there that's bridged by many UHV transmission lines. And I'm showing the 10 most utilized here, but China's building thousands of kilometers of these, about 15 gigawatts a year, and roughly 2 links a year, expected to reach about 200 gigawatts by 2025. Europe's also heavily investing in transmission. It's achieved ambitious targets for cross-border interconnectors as about 10% of their installed electricity production before 2020. Most of that's been already achieved by most countries, and now they're targeting 15% by 2030. India unified their power system back in 2013, and prior to that they had separate grids, and they've all been connected together now and synchronized, and they're rapidly increasing the amount of interregional transfer capability. By the end of the 13th plan in India, they'll have added another 25,000 kilometers of high voltage direct current or ultra high voltage transmission lines. Now, in contrast, the US, it does have strong transmission capacity between some regions, but the transfer across the 3 asynchronous zones, the Western, Eastern, Connect, and Texas, is still quite low. It's generally less than 1% of the installed generation capacity in those areas. In that sense, they're kind of behind some of the countries that I've just shown. But this appears to be getting more attention in the recent announcements, where they've planned to add about 20 gigawatts of transmission capacity to interregional capability. So the overall point I'm making here is that transmission still plays an important role in the future power system to enable remote renewables. Next, let's talk about digitalization. So I'd mentioned it's about a third of investment. More precisely, we estimate digitalization is roughly 45 billion, or 19% of investment in grid investment today, and it's going to grow to 100 billion by 2030. And at that point, it's part of every investment in the grid. So it's transformers, circuit breakers, power lines. They're all going to have sensors and monitoring equipment to help ensure efficient operation of the system. They're going to monitor health, enable remote action to improve reliability. There's really about 5 trends that are converging and driving on this digitalization. So the first one is decentralization. This is the need to maintain situational awareness as we increase the number of power plants on the grid. The second one is electrification, and it's the need for flexibility due to the new demand that's coming on the grid and how we can help balance generation with that new electrified load. A third driver is stakeholder issues, which requires us to look at non-wire alternatives in a more detailed and nuanced way. Aging infrastructure is perhaps the last one there, which is requiring us to monitor our fleets more closely. And actually, I would add reliability to that mix as well. With climate change happening, the ability to recover from outages is becoming increasingly challenging and an area of focus for utilities. Electrification is 2 trillion in grid investment, growing from 4% of annual investment today to about 17% in 2050. Now, this is smaller than what you might have expected, but one thing to note is that electrification mostly includes electric vehicles in the scenario that we ran. It doesn't include as much electrified heating or heat pumps, given our scenario description. The left chart includes all costs needed to supply the increase in demand from electrification, including, so you need new feeders, new distribution transformers, potentially even new transmission lines. And this amounts, so if you look at it for the electric vehicle portion, it's about $2,000 per electric vehicle, $2,000 in grid investment. The right chart is an additional portion of expenditure that we didn't include in the total numbers for grid investment. This is the portion of costs, which is the EV charging hardware and the local grid costs. And it's roughly $440 per vehicle, so it's an additional amount. Now, it's worth noting that load shifting technologies, investment in traditional grid infrastructure, it would drive it to be higher, right? We assume that almost half of our EV fleet is able to be dynamic and the load can shift to different times of the day, whether it's optimal for renewables or for congestion issues. And that helps reduce the scale of grid investment. At the last point, we looked at energy storage investment. So globally, the market grows to about 6 terawatt hours of applications by 2050, and that's shown on the diagram on the left. On the right, I show the portion that we classify as T&D investments in billions of dollars, and that's so T&D investments are the portion of energy storage that are providing peak load relief. They're improving the utilization of existing assets, and we think that's small, right? So it's 277 billion in the end, but that's still only 2% of the grid investment market. So the key message here is that, even though storage costs are rapidly dropping, it's still not at the point where we think it can cannibalize grid investment. Finally, to wrap up, I'll come back to the summary slide. The transition to electric heating and transport is driving up electricity demand, and there's tremendous growth of wind and solar, which is also straining the grid. Without adequate investment, the grid could become a bottleneck and slow progress on these key areas that we're trying to expand. And so there is a significant amount of investment needed. We anticipate 14 trillion to 2050. That's all I have for you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And let's shift to the Q&A session now. Hello, everyone. So please feel free to continue submitting questions throughout the Q&A. We have a few questions so far, and I'll go through answering those now. The first question we received during the session was that you're forecasting strong growth in investment, particularly for distribution, but is the regulatory environment really in place to support these investments, or are we going to have an investment gap in reality? So this is an excellent question. The one area in particular where there's the largest investment gap that we see is around digitalization. So the amount of investment that's happening on the distribution grid is partly due to this rise of renewables, which have this smaller scale, smaller median power plant size. and as a result, they're connecting onto the distribution grid, and so this kind of makes the amount of investment on the distribution grid swell. But most generating power plants need to be able to communicate bidirectionally with some sort of control center. That's how it's always worked on the transmission system, and this is what we are tending to see continue as the generation connects onto the distribution grid. But then, so now to have all the systems in place to be able to enable that digitalization is a challenge, partly because the regulatory schemes that are in place are generally rewarding a capex as opposed to rewarding some sort of capex avoidance, right? So let's take the example of a transmission line that you might have a limited rating and you're choosing between building a second transmission line to upgrade the capacity, or maybe you could put in a dynamic line rating system, and that could help you manage the more capacity more efficiently. The second option might be a lot more affordable, but since it has a lower capex, it generates a lower return for shareholders. It's not necessarily, you're not as incentivized to go down this path. And so different regulatory schemes serve different purposes. One isn't necessarily wrong and one isn't necessarily right. We're trying to achieve different things at different moments of time with our infrastructure. There was eras where we were trying to scale out the transmission and distribution system, and we wanted to attract investment. And so having some sort of regulatory scheme that would de-risk and attract investors was valuable. I guess the question that comes up now is, what is the appropriate regulatory scheme to tackle the problem that we're trying to take on right now, right? Where we actually probably need a bit more innovation. We need to look at money in a different way. Maybe CapEx expenditure optimization isn't the main one. And so we have some different models to work with. There's performance-based regulation schemes. In the UK, there's the RIO scheme as well, which is shown to be quite promising in promoting decarbonization. So I'll leave that question there. There's a second question here, which is, what is really included in the digital 1/3 shared? Does this include hardware investment, or does it include software? So yeah, that's a good question. 1/3 is quite a staggering total when you add it all up. And so what we've included, so on the hardware side, we're including transmission and distribution SCADA. So SCADA is the supervisory control and data acquisition systems that are needed. So that's the relays. So transitioning from electromagnetic traditional relays to digital relays, and then having substations entirely running on a digital standard. So there's EMS, ADMS systems, DERMS. So there is a software component in there, right? So the EMS, DMS, DERMS, APM tools, so the kind of asset management software. We don't include outage management software like GIS, geographical information systems, drones. That hasn't been included. So we have included some software packages in there as well. Yeah, so so it's a fairly comprehensive list of the questions of the both digital software and hardware that are included. Let's go to the next question here. What is your take on energy affordability of power and communication infrastructure? Historically, these have been thought of quite differently by investors. I agree. So I think we're ending up with a grid where the ability to move electrons for the purposes of transferring power and the ability to to move current for the purposes of transferring data are becoming closer. The gap between their importance is closing, right? And it's possible that the largest blackouts aren't going to happen because you have some congestion issue. It's actually because you have some inability to move data across the network, so you lose situational awareness. And so telecom investment will be crucial. And I think part of the challenge there is around cybersecurity. So what type of telecom links is the grid of the future going to require? Are we able to use existing lease lines through the existing telecom system that's been built by other providers? Are utilities going to have to build their own networks in order to be completely separate from the internet and make sure that they're secure? Do they have to use geodiverse fiber links, so that fiber links that are on two separate towers, or microwave diversity links, right? So what's the level of reliability that we're willing to have, and how much risk are we willing to maintain in terms of outsourcing that to a third-party provider? And there's a lot of decisions to make there. And so I think when we try to balance the cost of grid infrastructure and digital infrastructure, that's part of what we were trying to do in this analysis, is that there's a trade-off between, okay, well, why don't we just build more copper wires that move power, right? And that has this cost implication. It also has a footprint implication, and then you have this other option where you might not be able to do that, but you still have a significant telecom cost. And so there are trade-offs there. That's part of why you see telecom costs so high. Sorry, the digital cost so high is that actually the telecom component of it is the largest single segment in there. I'll go to the next question here. A lot of T&D network companies are seen as stable, unexciting businesses. Can they do more to capture value from the energy transition? Are there any leaders, or are there just going to be passive beneficiaries of the transition? So this is an interesting question. I think like the role of a T&D company in the transition, they are in some ways very passive, right? And that's, I think, part by design. They should be non-discriminatory for the most part. So if you're going to connect a generator, you can't provide preferential treatment to one source over the other. And I think if you foster that, there's dangerous potential outcomes. I think the decision of who gets to generate electricity is something that should be left externally, and that the transmission system should be very non-discriminatory with regards to what industry it connects, and with what type of energy producers it connects, and what timelines it allows them to connect in. And so I think that's the technologies, you can't necessarily bias towards one or the other, but there's things that the companies themselves have to do in order to support the energy transition as well, and that is to minimize their own footprint. So for example, and then the SF6 circuit breaker. So sulfur hexafluoride is a insulating material that's used in a lot of components such as circuit breakers and transformers, and this is it's a high carbon footprint gas. Reducing this, weaning off of this over time is a huge step that some of the utilities can take to distinguish themselves, and also their asset fleets when they're kind of going out and doing maintenance, making sure that they've electrified that as well. So these are areas where I think they can actually show a lot of distinction in how they're providing their services. All right, we have a few more questions coming in. So we have a question about whether the impact of COVID-19 was considered in the results, and so I'll tackle that one. So COVID-19. So this, this is a long-term outlook, and so the analysis is focusing mostly on what's going to happen beyond, COVID-19, and looking further out than that. But so there are a few things that COVID-19 does right away, right? And so, like when we were going through 2020, we thought there might be some changes in the amount of maintenance that was done. There might be some changes in the amount of generation that's connected, and what we've largely seen in 2020, we actually had a significant amount of wind and solar connected in record levels, and so the biggest impact really has been around the uncertainty about what demand is going to be materializing, and whether how long it'll take to recover. And so some of those grid projects that were in critical stages, you could actually push them out, and we've seen a bit of that in our conversations with utilities. But so like there's a soft downside there, but there's also a significant upside that we're seeing a lot about with infrastructure plans in the US and Europe, and this kind of green recovery. And so in total, we actually see it as a positive on the need to build out grid infrastructure and grid investment, as opposed to something that would slow it down. All right, so do you include electrification of industry in your scenario? So the portion of electrification that we've included in the results are described in full detail in our New Energy Outlook 2020, and so there's significant amount of air conditioning load in there. There's a significant amount of electric vehicle load in there as well, and industry and buildings are also included in that part. And so what we go and do is we figure out what the incremental component of uh, incremental capacity increase is on different areas. So for example, for industry, this could be a connection at 230 kV or 138 kV, or maybe even at the distribution voltages. And then we calculate from there how much investment is needed for those upgrades. So an industry application could trigger more upgrade per megawatt just because it'd be on a higher capacity level. Going through here. Is there a risk to grid reliability if EV adoption goes faster than expected? So the way I would tackle that, I think the bigger risk isn't to grid reliability. It's to the pace of EV adoption. Could the grid become a bottleneck? And so there's quite strict standards for reliability that are generally exist in North America and Europe, and they have to be observed. There's compliance issues if you don't observe them. If people will run simulations to ensure that their grid meets the reliability standards year on year, and then forecasting out for the future. And I think the risk is you get to a point where you start to see an exponential growth in EVs, and you realize that it's going to take you 5-10 years to put the necessary infrastructure in place to allow that to happen. And so then you start to have to maybe slow down the amount of adoption or the amount of chargers that can be deployed in a given area. And so that's partly the risk, as opposed to the adoption itself. So the reliability itself being impacted. How are grid operators, investors starting to think about the sustainability of grid infrastructure, i.e. recycling materials from old grid replacements? Yeah, so we've talked to a few utilities on this issue, and I actually worked for a utility myself that was tackling this. Um, So I can't speak for all utilities. I think one of the main things is around life extensions as well, right? So it's like getting the most out of your assets and making sure that uh, you are pushing them as far as they can. So you don't want to run them necessarily to failure, but as close to as possible. Um, and then there's second steps around making sure that you are keeping a certain number of spares so you can run that as long as possible, but you don't keep too many spares as well. So defining statistical methods for minimizing maximizing the life, minimizing the spare parts, right? So there's a minimalism there that needs to be used. As far as recycling materials from old grid parts, I haven't really seen this. I think the challenge really becomes from how much expertise the utilities retain themselves versus the OEMs, as some of the grid components become more and more complex. So you have these static compensators and some fairly complex devices, and kind of utilities moving towards this owner's engineer model, where a lot of the engineering expertise is outsourced to the OEMs, and the utilities are really just owners. So for example, if you're an owner of a vehicle, you're not necessarily in a position to be able to take apart a car and repair it and maybe repurpose some of the components. No, and a generation ago, that was not the case. The utilities had engineering expertise to be able to do all of this, right? And so they've moved towards this owner's engineer model as a kind of an effort of specialization to reduce OpEx, but you also lose some optionality when it comes to some of these sustainability efforts. So if you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do with an equipment, it's pushed off to the OEMs, right? So do they have a recycling program themselves, as opposed to the utilities being able to engage in this in that manner? I'm just going through the questions to see if I've gotten all of them. Um, are required grid investments proportional to the percentage of renewable energy in total energy supply? Yeah, so it is, so proportional is probably in the right ballpark. There is a correlation. There's a strong correlation between how renewable energy grows in a market and the amount of grid investment that happens. And so I see it on a scale. So as you know, if you go down, if you have power plants, you have large power plants on one side, and you have very small kind of rooftop power plants on the other side, and you have some medium power, utility scale solar and wind in the middle. As you move from the larger power plants down to these kind of medium-sized power plants, you are increasing investment on a gigawatt or megawatt basis, and that's partly because what we see is these resources are more remote, so there's a further distance to load centers, and secondly, there's more grid connections per gigawatt of capacity. So that means for each grid connection, there's a customer line, there's a terminal, and so you have this increase in cost that happens. Now, eventually, if you keep pushing through, right, and you get to the very small end where you're going to rooftop, you can actually forfeit the need for grid investment altogether. And you can start to see kind of a countervailing trend where grid investment could potentially reduce. And so when you look at a given forecast for a given area, you have to take those factors into consideration. So how much of it is actually going to be co-located with demand, and how much of it is going to be kind of located in these remote areas. Now, storage is another factor. So storage can help mitigate the need for grid investment by allowing you to more efficiently use the assets that you have. And so that's something we consider as well. But there is a general correlation between rising utility scale renewables and the need for grid investment. And I think we've gotten through most of the questions, if not all of them there. And we are at time, so I'll thank you guys there and then leave it there. And if there's any further questions, I'm sure we can follow up. The recording will be made available, and so please go back onto the link to see where you can find it there. Thank you very much. Bye.